Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 2 of the play-in stage of MSI in 2025. We get to go over day number 2 here. This is a pretty big one. Not only are we going to know our first team to officially qualify out of the play-in stage and into the main stage of MSI, but we have our first elimination series of the entire tournament here today in a best of 5. I'm excited to go over both of these series. Of course, a lot on the line for all 4 teams that are playing here today, but that's kind of the case for the entire tournament. You don't really want to drop games if you don't have to, and it kind of builds off of what happened on day number 1. We, of course, covered day 1 yesterday here on the channel. We did a primer and a power rankings video going over every single one of these teams. You can obviously check out those videos on the channel if you are interested before you watch this one, but certainly not required viewing if you just want to jump in here today. But without further ado, let's get into things. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in the 2 best of 5s that we got the previous day, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be talking about our final play-in series at the end of the video, kind of previewing what you can expect from the second place qualification matchup between the team that loses in the upper bracket and wins in the lower bracket here today, but most of this video will be spent talking about the 2 series that we got on day 2, so without further ado, let's jump right into the coverage. We've got a lot to talk about here today, and that kicks off with our lower bracket series. This one is arguably more important of these 2, because it's an elimination series. The loser is done. The loser is out. You don't really get a second chance. You've already used your extra life, if you will, in the play-in stage for both of these teams, and so they both have to step up. It's win or go home for both of them, and you don't really want to be the first team out, even if neither of these teams expected to be getting out of the play-in stage or were big underdogs to be able to get top 2 in the play-in stage. You don't want to be the last place team at MSI. That certainly is not the goal. It's a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LCP in GAM Esports and the number 2 seed from the LTA in Furia. I guess number 1 seed from the LTA South, if you really want to put it like that. But, 2 teams that I think expected to see themselves here. I don't think anybody was really looking at G2 or Bilibili Gaming as teams that should be losing, although G2 made it incredibly close on day number 1, and Furia made it incredibly close. You do have to give them credit for that as well, but these were the 2 teams I think we were expecting in the lower part of the bracket, and that's why I think we've talked and kind of considered this matchup quite a bit already. I think that there are some pluses and some minuses for both of these teams, and I'm kind of excited to go over where I think those end up lying. I think most importantly, there's one matchup in this series that is super intriguing to talk about, and that's the top lane matchup. It's Kiaya versus Gigo, and I think that that is such an interesting matchup. 2 really aggressive and fun top laners that both know how to win games. Really excited to see kind of main characters on the top side of the map go toe-to-toe. That's always been a big fun part of the play-in stage. It feels like for a lot of these minor region teams, I say minor region, all due respect to the LCP and the LTA South, I don't think they're bad regions, but in comparison to the big 4, a lot of the teams that end up coming out of these regions are very top lane focused. It's very funny how that's kind of been a trend over the course of basically all of these regions' history, even going back to like old Brazilian teams, even past couple years with Loud and like Robo, there's always been top laners that have been very successful coming out of South and Latin America. And then even going back to like Japan with players like Evi, top laners have always really been the cream of the crop in a lot of these, tier 2 regions, if you kind of want to call them that, or tier 3, however you want to break it up. And that is definitely the case between these 2 teams. Kiaya and Gigo are definitely the 2 main characters of each of their respective teams, but I think they get there in very different ways. I think GAM gets there through Levi in the jungle, obviously being able to try and establish pressure early. Great mid-game player. That's what he does at a really high level as he plays for these skirmishes and really wants to try to fight as much as possible, and I think they do that through mid-lane pressure as well. Not entirely because Emo and Eris are just like dominant players or anything like that, but rather because I think they love playing a lot of these roamers. Both of them do. Talia, Galio, Ryze, these are the champions that you're going to expect out of GAM, and they want to play for jungle, they want to play for topside, and then in a dream scenario, you have Artemis and Elio actually doing something on the bottom side. I'll kind of talk about why I don't necessarily think that that is the most consistent way to win, because I just don't really like how this bot lane plays, and I think that could be a negative, but when you're thinking of GAM's win condition in this series, I think it's getting pressure through mid-jungle, which I think is totally possible for Levi, Emo, and Eris, depending on who's in the game, and then it's getting Kiaya on the board and just getting him as many kills as possible so that he can take over in the late game. It's a bonus if you can get your bot lane into a good position, but I don't think it's necessary in order to win these games. And then for Furia on the other side, their win condition is pretty similar. First off, it's getting Gigo into a position where he can also carry in the late game. It's getting a top lane priority pick and, you know, making sure that you can push forward in that regard. But instead of Tatu and Toots kind of being the main characters, I think this really needs to be on Ayu and JoJo to really kind of push themselves forward. I've been very low on Artemis and Elio in terms of the tape that we've seen. I think Artemis has just quite frankly been bad throughout most of 2025. I think the tape in the LCP has just not been very good. And while I was very low on Ayu coming into this tournament, I think he can be better than Artemis. I think this is a matchup that Furia can win, and I really do like JoJo. I think JoJo might even just be a better support than someone like Elio. So I think for GAM, it's really going to be about the middle of the map. I think for Furia, it's about getting your bot lane into a position where they can actually win early and then transition that into winning top lane. So very excited for it. I think it's really, you know, a lot of tempo is going to matter in this series, especially for these teams that aren't quite as clean. I think making sure that you go into the late game with a gold lead is very important in basically any game that ends up being played. My prediction in this series from yesterday's video was GAM 3-2. We'll see if that lives up. I was very close to picking GAM 3-1. I think GAM are favorites here regardless of how Furia played against G2 yesterday and regardless of how GAM played against BLG, because I think BLG is just way better than anybody in the play-in stage. I didn't want to take too much from that series, but maybe Furia is a lot better than I'm giving them credit for, and maybe they can pull off the upset in my opinion here. But the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was GAM Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And this was a very, very strange game number 1. A very back and forth one, but not for good reasons. This was a very sloppy game from both of these teams. And yet GAM is the one who ends up having basically all the pressure throughout most of this game and ends up coming out on top because their positioning was just significantly better, at least from my perspective, throughout a lot of this game. You can talk about Furia, you know, playing some of these fights well. I think Toots actually had a really great game, and I've been very impressed with him at this tournament so far. His play against G2 was actually really solid, specifically in lane against Caps, and he was really good in this game for Furia. Not only was he the one pushing them forward in a lot of skirmishes in the mid game, as Ari generally does, but also he stole Baron. Like, that's ginormous for this team and actually created a situation where Furia had the chance to be able to come back in this one. It just didn't really end up mattering. Their team fighting wasn't good enough. Their 5v5 wasn't good enough, and that's why GAM ends up coming out on top. If you are new here, what we're going to do is, of course, talk about the draft first and foremost, kind of get into what I expect from that, and then move on, of course, to, you know, how that ended up playing out on the Rift. I think these two drafts are basically identical. They do have slightly different win conditions if you really want to put it there, but I think in terms of spikes, you've got a middle of the map, in this case, Pantheon Talia versus Xinjiao Ari, that wants to play fast and aggressive and try to skirmish and get picks early. That's kind of the general meta, and so it makes a lot of sense that both teams would go there. You've got top laners who are AP threats that want to try and be more useful in team fights. Galio, obviously, a bit more of a macro presence to try to make up for the Talia in the mid lane, and the Pantheon on the other side of this. Rumble just more straightforward in terms of raw damage coming in. I think I like Rumble a lot more in this matchup. And then you've got quote-unquote hyper carries coming down into the bot lane to be more insurance policies in the back half of the game if you don't get that big lead through your jungle mid in the mid game, and that's Xayah, that's Smolder. And so two very similar comps, almost identical comps in my opinion. I do think they end up playing a bit different. I think Furia has more pressure in the side lane. I think Galio ends up just offering a bit more in the late game if you do want to split push and play for like a 1-3-1 or a 4-1 setting, whereas I think GAM is a little bit more forced into late game team fights, but also I think GAM's front to back is just better in terms of how they're set up. I think they have more protection for Xayah if they really just want to get into like a hyper carry off, which is essentially what happened down the stretch here. Xayah versus Smolder ended up really being the matchup that mattered, and GAM just had more going for them to allow the Xayah to take over in the late game. And so not really a lot to talk about in terms of differences in draft or things that I personally would have changed. The only thing I'll say is that yesterday I made a pretty big point on this channel to kind of talk about how I think Ari is bait at the current moment, at least at the level that she's being picked right now. Do I think she's as good as a lot of the other top tier mid laners? No, I don't. I think she's like a tier down probably from the best mid laners in the game, mostly because I think she has a pretty bad matchup into most of the good mid laners, specifically Talia. You know, obviously, you know, she can get stunned on the ground, and that's basically her entire engage. Now, Toots played this really well. well, and there weren't a lot of engages around the Talia. You wanted to try to make plays elsewhere on the map, but for the most part, it's really hard for a champion like Ahri to be able to take over this game in the same way that Talia and Pantheon can do. I just think it's, more difficult to execute for an Ahri than it is for a Talia or even a Galio or a Ryze or a lot of these other macro-oriented mid laners, and so I would put her a little bit lower on the priority list than those other champions. Doesn't really seem like a lot of pros agree with me, so, what do I know, but just something worth pointing out, at least something I wanted to identify in draft here. But GAM ends up just outplaying a lot of these team fights. Specifically, they end up catching out IU really early on, and basically every single fight here on the Smolder, his positioning was pretty horrible down the stretch of this game, and that meant that the Xayah was really the only hyper carry that could actually get a lot of damage off, and Artemis made the most of it. Credit to him. He's gonna get player of the game for game 1. I've been super critical of Artemis. I honestly have been pretty vocal about not being a fan of his gameplay and just the way he's looked on tape, but at the end of the day, if he's gonna be able to step up and actually be able to hyper carry in the back half of these games, that's what matters. He was put on an easier role than maybe he's expected to be normally. I think generally speaking, you're seeing a lot of pressure go through Emo in the early game so that they can move around on those macro threats, things like Talia on B1, and then Levi and Kiaya obviously having a ton of tempo on the top side, and bot lane just kind of being along for the ride, usually down in gold in the early game and then figuring something out to at least be able to survive in the late game. That was kind of the case here, but again, going into Smolder means that you actually do have priority early on in the game. You're going to have prio mid because you're Pantheon Talia, and as much as I like Xin Zhao, it's just really hard for him to be able to match that in terms of tempo, because again, Pantheon Talia is going to be everywhere on the map, and then you've also got Xayah into Smolder, which is a winning matchup for Xayah. You say what you want about Xayah, she might not hyper carry as much as Jinx or, any of these other, Zeri, Kai'Sa, whatever, the Smolder, these other hyper carries that are in the meta, but her laning phase is significantly better than those champions, and obviously she's very safe in that regard as well. So Artemis actually had a lot of tempo in the bot lane and was able to express that. IU was really far behind in this game on the Smolder. It took him a while to actually start being relevant. His build was pretty bad, and again, Artemis took advantage of it. Credit to Emo. I think the Weaver's Walls actually made it really easy for Artemis to fight in a lot of these games, or a lot of these endgame team fights, but you still have to execute. That's exactly what the bot lane did, and again, if the bot lane's going to step up and be better, I think that's Furia's biggest advantage in this series, is that I think JoJo is just the best player in the bot lane. If Artemis is going to be good, and if IU in particular is going to be really bad, that's a pretty big problem for Furia. Elio was also fine. Certainly no issues with him on the recon. He was aggressive. He tried to be a playmaker in this one. That's what you want to see from a lot of these teams. You want to see them try to take hold of the reins themselves, try to be the ones to push the game forward on their own accord rather than playing reactive, and I don't think GAM was all that reactive here. Kiaya was also excellent on the top side on the Rumble. Those ultimates were actually just really good, and he was never really in danger. The amount of damage he was able to put out basically throughout the entirety of this game, super commendable. I mean, Kiaya's awesome, but, top lane's gonna matter a lot in this series. If Gigo can get the upper hand, that's big for Furia. If Kiaya's just the better player, which I think is super possible, then that's really huge for GAM. Levi and Emo were also fine. Levi in particular had a pretty decent mid game and, took very little damage in the back half of this on the Pantheon, but for the most part, this was just whose hyper carry can get more ahead as we get into the late game, and that was GAM in this one. And then for Furia on the other side, like I said, if IU had played just slightly better, maybe things go a tad bit different in this game. That's just not really how it ended up going down. IU is going to get dud of the game. I'm really not a fan of Smolder. I think that champion does so little damage in comparison to what he's drafted to do. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that Smolder is low damage, but in comparison to, I don't know, Zeri or Jinx or a lot of these Kai'Sa, a lot of these other carries that are really strong in the back half of the game, is Smolder is less damage than those champions, and he's harder to execute on because his range is just a little bit lower than maybe you would want, and especially in a comp like this where, yes, you have some protection, right? You have Galio, who can help self-peel. You have Ahri Charm, which theoretically, I guess, is peel. Rel wants to go in. Xin Zhao probably wants to go in, especially against a comp that is going to huddle around this Xayah and really use her as protection. Smolder has to be able to self-peel in this one, and that just takes away a lot of his ability to actually fight in these, big exchanges, and generally you have a Weaver's Wall coming in on the back end of these fights, and all of a sudden Smolder's kind of stuck in a lot of these instances, and that's why IU was dying first. I will say, if you're IU in this game, you have to be cognizant of that, and you have to be willing to back off earlier on in these exchanges. You have to be willing to stay a little bit more passive, because if you're caught out early on like he was for most of this game, you're just going to lose. You're going to lose the game. There's not really going to be a lot to play for, but it's a bad setup, and I don't think Smolder was the right pick here. That's really my only criticism. It's not, the idea of the champion. I just don't know if Smolder is the champion I would personally be going for if I'm going for a hyper carry, especially in game 1 of a best of 5. Again, Toots was really good. I think there's a lot to like about how the Ahri ended up playing. I think Tatu was generally fine, but JoJo couldn't really get a foothold in on the Rel. Basically a useless game from him. Not entirely his fault, but not not really a good one. And then Gigo also was just down in pressure the entire game. I don't like Galio top lane. I said that in the meta report video. I think it's overvalued right now as an answer to things like Rumble and Gwen, and I think we kind of saw why in this game. So for Furia, they're down 0-1, but this was kind of back and forth. There was an opportunity for them to win. It all really came down to late game team fights. They weren't blown out or anything. They still have a foothold in this series. And for GAM on the other side, like 1-0 is obviously great, but you got to keep your foot on the gas. Anybody can throw away a 1-0 lead, and especially if it just goes 1-1 and you basically go into a best of 3 going into game 3, like everything starts over at that point. So you need to keep it up and you need to be able to win game 2. But are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Furia. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and we've got at the very least a slightly back and forth series here as Furia really dominates this second game. It really was not close. Really, after the first 10 minutes, this game was over. Not really a lot to play for GAM. Vi gets absolutely torched in the early game here, and there's just no way for GAM to be able to play it out from that point. Credit to Furia. I think they had a pretty good game plan in this one. I think their draft was pretty solid. Very strange, though. I just want to say this, like, this team prioritizes red side super heavily, and I've seen on Twitter a lot of people kind of liking that decision. I don't get it, man. Like, what about red side do we like right now? What are you saving counter pick for? Because it's R5 Leona, like, great. You know, Alistair was already banned and taken off the board, and so, like, whatever, man. It's Nautilus Leona. Like, are you really feeling super confident that you got counter pick there? I get that you get to see the priority for GAM here, in this case, the Gwen on B1. And answer that with whatever you want. In this case, your highest priority jungle mid, which is the Wukong and the Annie. But it just feels very strange to me. Like, I don't know. I don't really like red side. I still think it's a bad decision overall, and I think that's something that will get weeded out as the tournament continues to go along. We've already seen the top tier teams at this tournament not do that, and so I would imagine that continues to be the case moving forward. But specifically talking about the draft that we actually got, I do think there are some interesting pieces. Once again, I don't think these drafts are all that dissimilar. I think there is still a lot to like, but once again, I do like blue side just a tad bit more, because I think Gwen is actually really strong in this game, and Kiaya, if he is able to get gold, I think theoretically could be able to take over. Obviously, you do have a couple of other options going in Furia's favor. I think Wukong's engage is going to be significantly more consistent, even if I do really like Vi and her ability to start fights. I also think Vi is overrated, as I've said a lot on this channel, and I don't really love Jax, like, theoretically as a champion. Corki, I think, has been something that has underperformed. It's a couple of champions that just have not lived up to the hype, in my opinion. That all got thrown out the window. This was a gigantic execution diff in favor of Furia, and that's exactly where I want to point this out. Gigo had an absolutely monstrous Jax performance in this game, and he's obviously player of the game for game number 2. 10-1-5 on the Jax, obliterated Kiaya, obliterated Levi throughout the entirety of this game as well. It wasn't just like, oh, the Jax won lane and ended up taking over the game. It's like, oh no, Jax is jumping onto 5 members in team fights, and he's showing up to grubs and absolutely obliterating people, and it's not particularly close. It's a really good performance from a player that we talked about needing to step up and needing to be kind of a main character for Furia. Well, that's exactly what he was here in game number 2. I think he did a great job of really showcasing that. But I think it would be disingenuous to sit here and say that it's just Gigo, that it's just the Jax being able to take over. Obviously, him throwing on a counter-strike, pressing R, and jumping onto 4 people on the backline is pretty darn good, and it's pretty difficult to kill him when he's so accelerated throughout a lot of this game. But I do think there are a lot of other players that played great, specifically Toots in the mid lane. I think had another really good game in this one on the Annie. I thought his setups were actually pretty fantastic. There was a moment at the end of this game where Tibbers was basically 1v9ing the entire enemy team, like 1v5. They couldn't actually kill him. You know, I love Aurora. I think Aurora is an incredibly strong champion right now with the amount of damage that she can do, but it's crazy what happens when, you know, Annie is accelerated. Even with Tibbers being nerfed over the past couple of patches, it seems like it doesn't really end up mattering. Like, Annie's really strong just in general, and her setup is super consistent. You had a couple of late game carries here, Jax and the Corki, and I think Toots actually did a great job of making sure that those champions were in a position to be able to carry the game. Same thing for JoJo on this Leona. You know, I was kind of laughing about the Leona R5 pick. I didn't necessarily think that that was worth picking red side for, at least in my opinion, but JoJo was excellent in this game. Going deathless on Leona means that things are going quite right for the team overall, and I think that's fair to say. Tatu had a good game, IU had a good game. Everything really working for Furia, playing around the Jax and, you know, playing around Annie setups and just being able to utilize a lot of the more aggressive plays that you wanted to make to really push the tempo forward. I think that's a fair way to call out what Furia did in this kind of dominating victory. And then for GAM on the other side, they just got absolutely blasted in the early game and never really had a way to recover. Levi was horrible in this game. He's going to get dead of the game, but this is like the problem with Vi that I've always talked about. She is one of those champions where she either has gold in the early game and can play in the mid and late game in the way that she wants to or she doesn't, and she's really bad as a champion, and I think that's even worse for someone like Vi than it is for someone like Xin Zhao or like Pantheon. Like, obviously those champs kind of fall into similar camps in terms of, oh, we want to win and we want to skirmish and find these picks and play for mid games and like yada yada yada, right? Like, utilize the early part of the game and not play for team fights. Like, I get that they're in the same boat there, but I think the difference is that Xin Zhao has, you know, pieces that can stay relevant. The ult is going to stay relevant. Like, for Pantheon, he's always going to be a macro threat. He has a point and click stun. You know, the damage is basically always going to come through. Like, that champion is almost always going to be relevant, even if he's not carrying the game. Vi is one of those champs where if you don't have gold, if you're behind in terms of resources, well, now you're going in and dying immediately because your survivability is 0 without gold, and that's kind of a big problem. And Levi being like 0-4 through the first 10 minutes of the game or whatever it was, it just makes it almost impossible to be able to win this. Obviously, Vi still has a lot going for her. She's got like a 2 or 3 second cooldown on her engage later on in the game with her Q, and so you can't be too mad, and it's not like it was just Levi who ended up losing, but I do think that we're starting to see like Vi and Ahri in particular as two champions that just are not as successful at this level as maybe people want them to be at the current moment. Same thing for Kiaya on the top side, except this time he kind of just got blasted in the 1v1. It wasn't particularly close. Part of this is Vi not having any tempo and it being really hard for Gwen to play these games, especially once they start skirmishing around the top side, but you know, he ends up being very useless on the Gwen, a champion that I think was very important towards their comp. Emo couldn't really burst anybody down. Artemis and Elio weren't necessarily the problem, but it's Jhin Nautilus. It's not like they were ever going to be the solution or anything like that. GAM just kind of lost, and especially after winning game number 1 in kind of a tight game, you know, really just one where they had a better team fight comp, I'm not exactly sure I feel super confident in GAM going into game number 3, but they have to feel confident in themselves because, as I talk about a lot on this channel, I think game 3 is the most important game in a best of 5. I think especially when things are tied up at 1 apiece, but even in any other direction, like, you know, 1-1, taking that 2-1 series lead in something like this is ginormous towards your success rate down the stretch of this series. If Furia is going to be able to do it, especially after having the more dominant victory, that's going to kind of move confidence in their favor. If GAM is going to be able to pull it back, well, now Furia has to win both of the final 2 games, and this team is already pretty flippy with players that I think can underperform at any moment. So a big game number 3 for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Furia. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series 2-1, and they're going to put GAM on tournament point essentially here as we head into game number 4. Big win for Furia. Again, a very strong one just overall. Not really a lot of, you know, countermeasures put in place by GAM. Furia's 2 wins have definitely been the 2 more dominant games of this series as opposed to game number 1, which was a bit more back and forth, and this is with, you know, Eris coming into the mid lane, Emo coming out. I know a lot of people prefer Eris as a player and just generally see his upside a little bit more so. You know, I kind of get that. I think mechanically he's definitely better. I think Emo's very stable in the mid lane, and so, you know, I'm not necessarily, you know, sitting here saying that either of those players are significantly more valuable to GAM than the other, at least from my perspective, from what I've seen in my limited tape of both, but it doesn't really matter right now. Furia's just kind of winning. They're just kind of the better team, and they're doing it through some smart drafts. I think this is probably their best draft of the entire series, and I certainly think GAM is just trying too hard. Like, they're thinking a little bit too much, I think, about how things are going in draft, and then they're not thinking enough in game. Their macro has been quite bad over the past 2 games, which we will definitely get into, but as per usual, let's go ahead and go over the draft first and foremost. It's pretty easy to talk about what GAM wants to do in this one because I don't think anyone's really gonna be, you know, against me if I say that GAM wants to win early. They picked Kalista Nico. They want to try and win through the 2v2. You've got Twisted Fate to try and move things around the map, but you have Kha'Zix, you have Aatrox. Like, this is not a team that can ever team fight. Like, at any point in the game, they're never going to be able to 5v5. It's just not really going to be able to happen for them. I think they get weaker as the game goes along. Maybe you can convince me that the engage from Nico can set up for an Aatrox Kalista late game, but, you know, Kha'Zix is not useful in team fights. Twisted Fate is really not particularly useful in team fights. I will talk more about that champion as we get later on in this because he's currently the highest priority champion at the entire tournament. He's very consistently been banned. I think TF is mega bait at this tournament. I'm going to be honest. I think that champ is just not as good for pro right now as he is for solo queue, and I think a lot of teams are going to kind of learn that the hard way, but, you know, this team's not really going to be able to fight regardless of, I think, what their idea was, specifically because of that mid-jungle duo duo, I think it just takes out really any opportunity for them to do so. And Furia, while they're also, kind of an early game team, you're playing around Mbessa in the top lane, you're playing around Ashe Seraphine, which is a 2v2 lane. I do think you scale significantly better. Your team fight's way easier at the very least because you do have like designated front line here with Poppy and Mbessa to be able to do things. You have Sylas who can steal Nico ultimate, so that's a free engage. You have Sylas who can steal Twisted Fate ultimate as well, and so you've got a couple options on that front. Even the Aatrox ult can be particularly useful for Toots, and Ashe is kind of the counter to Kalista. I've talked about this a lot. Kalista's been very high prio throughout the entirety of the year, and so a lot of teams have tried to cook up like these weird counter picks to Kalista. The one that has really stuck, at least for me, and has actually been successful is not only Ashe as an AD carry and not as a support, because I think when you see like Misfortune Ashe or like Caitlyn Ashe or whatever, it doesn't actually work out in the way that you would want. It's Ashe as the AD carry and specifically Seraphine as the support. I think this has clearly been the most successful answer to Kalista throughout this year, and we saw it once again here. This was a really successful laning phase for IU and JoJo, and they're actually going to be the main players of this game. IU's going to get player of the game. He got accelerated pretty early here on the Ashe, was super far ahead as we headed into the mid game, and again, even though Furia's comp doesn't really do anything in the mid game, because let's be honest, like it's really hard for them to make plays against a Twisted Fate and a Kha'Zix, and like you just don't really want to push your advantage too much in that phase. As long as they were able to, kind of stabilize and solidify things, eventually Ashe is just going to be able to free hit on the backline here because you don't have a ton of backline access as long as, Furia is actually playing well. To be able to get onto the Ashe, you have Sylas for free engages, you have Poppy and Mbessa that can basically be full-time peel on this team if you really need them to. Seraphine's also there for that as well, so Ashe is just basically able to free hit on the backline, and it makes these fights incredibly easy to execute on, and Furia obviously took full advantage of that, and IU had his first real great game of the entire tournament. He's been quite bad. Like, let's just say it the way it is. He's been the worst player on this team so far at this tournament. This is a really great time for him to be able to step up. He was a big reason why they lost game 3 against G2, and so it's really cool to see him step up in game 3 here to actually push them forward against GAM. I think JoJo's also not going to get enough credit for how he played on the Seraphine. I think Seraphine's a huge part of why this comp ends up working the way that it wants to. I think Sarah's super underplayed and undervalued. I think Enchanters and just like these aggressive AP mages in the bot lane are just underplayed throughout the entirety of League because people just want engage threats there. They don't want to have to draft them elsewhere. But JoJo actually played really excellent in this game. His positioning is really, really solid. JoJo's great games at this tournament have genuinely been fantastic. You could say that against G2 as well, where he really stepped up and was very important in their 2-game wins as well. I just like JoJo as a player, and I think he's going a bit undervalued, but with IU stepping up as well, that's huge. Toots has been awesome at this tournament, way better than I could have ever expected. Gigo ends up having an up and down game, ends up getting solo killed by Kiaya, but, for the most part wasn't a huge problem for his team. Tatu was obviously great on the Poppy. Really, the only positive for GAM is just that they didn't get absolutely slaughtered in every facet of the game, but this still was a very big win for Furia. They certainly had better macro and better decision making as this game went along, and that was a big determining factor. And then for GAM on the other side, like I said, it just kind of was a bad game overall for them. Not only do I think their draft is quite bad, I think Kalista Nico, especially with Ashe on the board, Ashe Seraphine kind of counters that in the bot lane. You're looking at Kha'Zix Twisted Fate as your mid-jungle duo, which, some people are going to really like. I really hate this. I think this is like actively trying to lose the game in terms of your mid-jungle duo. I think TF is playable. I think he's a slight tier below things like Galio and Ryze in the mid lane in terms of like what he offers, because I don't think there's any damage coming out of Twisted Fate, at least like not, relevant damage. And I think setup wise, like you can get similar results out of other champions, especially like over prioritizing him over things like, Ryze or Talia, which obviously they're not doing in this game. But, I think Twisted Fate is a game 3 or a game 4 type of pick, not something that I would really be all that worried about in game number 1. And then Kha'Zix, I think is just bad. I've never liked Kha'Zix in pro. I think you just have to be the better player by a lot in order to make that work. And, maybe Levi thought he was the better player by a lot, but coming off of that Vi game, going to an assassin, which definitely feels more comfortable for his playstyle, like it just feels like he's kind of running out of ideas, and it's game 3 at MSI, and that's really not a good sign. Kiaya got 1 solo kill and then got blasted the entire rest of the game by overextending and being way too far forward inside lanes, but Artemis is actually going to be getting my dead of the game because the Kalista not being relevant just completely takes out any win condition for GAM. Like, look at the rest of this team. Who wins the game for GAM? It's only Kalista. It genuinely, like, it's only ever going to be Kalista, and Kalista got counterpicked. I mean, Elio was also not particularly good on the Nico. A couple of nice engages, a couple of really bad ultimates as well. For the most part, Sylas had better Nico ults than Elio did, which is never really a great sign, but GAM just was not good enough. Like, this was probably their weakest game of the entire series, and now they're facing tournament point. They have to win game 4, and they have to win game 5, but you gotta start here in game number 4. Can they push us to a Silver Scrapes game 5, or is Furia going to show that it was not a fluke that they ended up taking G2 to 5 games? They actually are one of the scarier teams in the play-in stage. Well, the winner of game number 4 was GAM Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. The second game 5 in a row for Furia after they just came off of that game 5 versus G2. GAM's first game 5 of the entire tournament, and they're the ones who have to force it. And they have to do it in kind of a crazy game, kind of a very weird one that ended up kind of breaking down in a very weird way. I think it's very clear the direction that both of these teams want to go in. Furia drafts a very standard comp, with the exception of Yasuo AD carry, which obviously is not particularly standard. It makes a lot of sense for them and their individual players because IU plays a lot of Yasuo. This is something that's been banned for them, or against them, I guess, across this entire tournament. Really, up until this point, it's clear that teams were worried a bit about IU picking up Yasuo. It wasn't really a difference maker at all in this game. I don't generally think that Yasuo is particularly good. I think he's in a good spot, like generally, like as a champion. I just not for pro, not really the thing that I would, be picking up in the bot lane, especially in a game like this. But Furia had a real chance to be able to win this. They actually were able to kind of control a lot of the mid to late game here, and you can expect that. I mean, you're lining up a Skarner or a Azir to be able to team fight in the later half of the game, and that kind of gets into the draft mindset here of like, GAM kind of does need to utilize their advantages early to end this game as quickly as possible, because I don't think they win as, strongly late as maybe they would want to, or at least you wouldn't think so on paper. You've got the Viego for scaling, and if LeBlanc is accelerated, things do get a lot easier, but really what you're looking at are 3 lanes that I think should be able to be won by GAM because of the Viego pressure, specifically mid lane, where LeBlanc should be able to kind of roam around and do whatever she wants. That's the advantage of playing something like LeBlanc into Azir, is the priority that you're able to generate on that champion. And with Eris in, who's definitely much more of an active player, somebody who does want to be more aggressive in terms of the skirmishes, you really want to try to get that champion snowballing. My problem with LeBlanc, and the kind of take I've had on her all year, is that while she is very good at being able to both survive and deal damage, she's always been that kind of assassin that never really has to worry too much about herself. She doesn't really do enough damage without gold to justify picking her as an assassin. Typically speaking, you need to be accelerated in order to one-shot people, and if you're not one-shotting people, then LeBlanc's not particularly useful, at least in comparison to some of the other assassins that you would consider for the mid lane, or champions that kind of fit similar roles. Sylas isn't an assassin, but something that's a similar role. Akali's banned out this game, but things of that nature, right? Like, LeBlanc has always been a tier below, I would say, what those champions can offer, and I think in this game we kind of saw why. I will say that GAM didn't necessarily dominate the early game in the way that they probably wanted to, but Furia also didn't dominate the late game in the way that they probably wanted to when they picked Skarner Azir as their mid-jungle duo, which is clearly the direction that they want to go in. I really don't like their lane matchups. I think the B5 Renekton is totally fine, except I think R5 Cassante is even better for GAM. I think you're looking at a situation where the Yasuo doesn't necessarily have a ton of pressure. Again, I'm just a lot lower on Yasuo. I do like B1 Alistar, especially because of all of the things that are taken off the board at this point. I think highly prioritizing that champion makes a lot of sense, and I think teams are sometimes scared to early pick their support. I get that Braum's really good in this matchup, and Lucian Braum has very much emerged as the Lucian lane, and one of the stronger 2v2s in the entire game, but Alistar can still be a big problem as this game continues to go along as an engaged threat. Again, the problem was just that Furia misplayed a couple of key fights down the stretch that they probably should have won and just didn't. Toots, unfortunately, with all of the gold, ends up contracting a case of LEC Azir syndrome, as I call it on this channel, and killing himself in the final fight, and that allows GAM to be able to pick up the win. But, we're ahead of ourselves. Let's go ahead and talk about what GAM did right in this one. Levi is the obvious choice for player of the game. You didn't really have to think about this. This Viego really took over in the late game. The resets were the biggest problem. If they were able to shut down Viego, they probably won the game. The fact that they weren't able to shut down Viego, the fact that Levi was super patient in that final fight, ends up really paying off, and generally speaking allows GAM to be able to run through. Well, Viego's really the only late game piece in this entire team comp. Yes, you can play through LeBlanc Lucian in terms of damage in the later half of the game. It's just a lot more difficult than it would be to play through almost anything else in terms of a carry duo. But if Levi is going to take that role as kind of the #1 option in these team fights, and if he is going to get support from things like Braum and Cassante, yeah, things do get at least a little bit easier overall for GAM. So credit to Levi. I think he played really well. It was an important game for him to have because games 2 and 3, I think he was really bad. The Vi in game 2 was awful. The Kha'Zix pick in game 3 kind of made him useless in general. I know aggressive picks are kind of his style, but it's nice to see him pull one out that actually can be relevant at a pro level like Viego and actually make the most of it. Like the 11, 2, and 8 is indicative of how important he was overall to this team. I also do want to give a shout out to, like I said, Kiaya and Elio. I think Elio in particular might not get enough credit for how well he played on the Braum. I love Braum. I think this champion might even be undervalued. Yes, there are some matchups that he's not great into, but he actually does have a pretty favorable matchup into Alistair, who I think is the most consistent engaged support in the entire game because he matches up well specifically into Rel, who I would consider the other, major one. Obviously, Nautilus is there as well, but I think, Alistair is kind of the 1A, at least in my opinion, and Braum, I think, has a very favorable matchup into Alistair, which makes Braum super valuable. He also combos really well with, champions like Lucian or Misfortune or whatever, right? Because not only can you take away the ability for, Braum to be a protection against their damage in the early game, but also his, early 2v2 is very good. One of the best of any melee champion in the entire game, and Lucian obviously can punish that pretty heavily. So really like that duo. I'm glad it's been rising in popularity over things like Nami and over things like Milio that I personally just don't think are as good right now, at least in terms of like what Lucian specifically wants to do. Eris was the only one on the team that didn't really get to do anything. This LeBlanc was like super behind, and that's okay. Like it happens every once in a while, but this is the problem with the champion. If she's not super ahead in terms of gold, it's really not a useful pick, and overall I think LeBlanc is very niche in the meta right now, but GAM still had enough firepower to be able to win team fights, if only because Levi was just really strong and he played patient enough to be able to get those resets. Elio had some really nice peel moments in the back half of the game, and Kiaya I also thought had a couple of really nice setups on the Cassante. And then for Furia on the other side, like again, it's unfortunate, man. You probably should have won this game in terms of how things were going. It felt like the tide was starting to swing in their favor, and also their team fight is just kind of better on paper, especially if the Yasuo can do any damage whatsoever. He was getting 3-man ultimates at times. He just wasn't really doing any damage, which was kind of a big problem for this team, but Toots had gold on the Azir. He's generally been really good throughout this series and throughout this tournament, and this was a big moment for him to step up. All he needed to do was stand in the back, make sure he didn't die, and pump out DPS, and they probably had enough to be able to burst through the front line of GAM, but he goes for the hero play. The LEC Azir syndrome ends up activating in his brain, and he feels like he has to be the engaged. The Shuriman shuffle has to come through, and he ends up killing himself in the final fight, ends up completely throwing the game for Furia, and it's just unfortunate. Like, I really like Toots as a player, and he was their win condition throughout a majority of this game, but without that play, is Furia moving on? Maybe. Like, I really do think that could be like a tournament losing play from Toots, and that's just a really unfortunate thing to talk about. I also think you can kind of point out that the bot lane didn't really do anything this game. Again, IU and JoJo have just not been impressive. IU, as JoJo's been good. In their wins, especially JoJo, leaving IU and actually getting to unlock himself on the map actually does look like a really good player, but IU is just not particularly useful. And again, this is his signature pick, and he still didn't get to do anything on it. Tatu was an enabler on Skarner, missed a couple of ultimates that were really big, but it's actually Gigo who's going to be getting my dud of the game here. The Renekton just was never useful, and I really don't know how Renekton fits into this comp. I get that you just want something stable that he probably is good at on the top side, but the problem is you're playing for Skarner Azir as your win condition here, like a late game team fighting win condition, and Renekton's just not really going to be all that useful in terms of being able to get you there. Gigo, I don't think, had a great game, and again, he is a turning point for Furia. If the solo laners are going to be able to win, they're going to be able to win games, but if they're not, if they're going to make mistakes like they did in this one, then they're going to lose, and now we're going to a Silver Scrapes Game 5, and remember, they've done this once before, and they weren't able to get over the hump in that Game 5. They kind of got blasted in the final game of that series. Is that going to happen again? Is GAM going to be able to make the 2-1 comeback real, or is Furia going to be able to say, well, we were better on day 1, and even though we made it close, we are better here on day 2? Well, the only way to know is to go over the game, so let's get into it. The winner of game number 5 was GAM. They are going to take game number 5. GAM Esports will pick up the series win 3-2, and they will be moving on to the final qualification series. And unfortunately, this is the end of the road for Furia. This is the end of the road for the LTA South, and I think they put up a really good fight. This was a pretty close game number 5. I wouldn't say it was quite as close as game 4 was, or even game 1, but it definitely was. All 3 of Furia's losses in this series were competitive, at the very least. They didn't get blown out in really any of the games. This was really the only one where GAM really felt like they controlled everything. And honestly, I just love GAM's draft. I think they give themselves quite a few options here, especially into what Furia had as options available to them with what's left in the draft. And, you know, with what Furia had already shown at the beginning of the draft, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to opt into the things that they opted into. Not all of them, I think, make a lot of sense. I'm not sure this is the best Neferi game to ever, you know, exist in the entirety of the universe, but I love things like R5 Gangplank. I love the Orianna early priority here because I do think it just opens up more opportunities, and again, generally, I think it just creates options for the draft, which we will, you know, kind of talk about here. I know this doesn't really make a lot of sense, and you're going to have to stick with me here, but the Kassadin team does not outscale in this game. I know that that feels very weird to say. Like, Toots ends up picking Kassadin on B5, but the problem with Kassadin here is it feels more slapped on to a team that already just wants to win early, rather than a pick that, you know, kind of solidifies a playstyle and really creates a win condition for the team as a whole. It's going to be hard for Kassadin to 1v9 this game if you go late, and we kind of saw that. Like, he got to level 16, the team was already down by quite a bit, but even if they weren't, let's say they were in a good spot, and at least an okay spot, well, there's a lot of ways for Kassadin actually to get slowed down quite a bit, and kind of to get buffered a little bit for GAM in this game. Not only is Orianna generally just very good for that into Kassadin because, you know, Shockwave ends up kind of pulling him out if you can time it right, you know, kind of time it when his R is on, you know, small cooldown, if you will. But also, I think Gangplank on R5 really makes it very difficult for Kassadin to feel like he can take over this game. One wrong barrel chain and, like, Kassadin's just dead in a fight, especially with things like Kaisa, Orianna, you know, Shield going on top of these things. Neferi is so much damage. Like, GAM's late game is terrifyingly good, and I just don't really know if Kassadin can beat all of it, really, at any given moment. I think this team was going to have to win early. They were going to have to, you know, generate tempo, and most of that was going to have to be through bot lane with Ayu and Jojo, and I just don't know performance-wise if that's the direction I personally would have gone. I would have personally, you know, preferred having players like Tatu and Toots, you know, having more agency in the early game to try and create their own advantage, and then just hope and pray Ayu and Jojo can actually be relevant in the back half of the game, instead of highly prioritizing something like Ezreal in this draft. And even the Karma, although I love Ezreal Karma, and I do think it's really good in this game, I think you put so much pressure on them to be able to actually win skirmishes in the mid game that when they didn't, pretty obviously, because they aren't as good in terms of their player skill, to be entirely frank, things just kind of fell apart, and that just ended up being the case. I think it also hurts that top lane ended up having a really bad series overall, which is super important to Furia, and, you know, Toots just couldn't quite carry. Tatu, I think, had an okay game, but jungle mid, they were the best performing players in this series, and they weren't really given the agency to actually control where the tempo went in this game, in the early game. And so for GAM, with this, like, hyper scaling comp of playing Orianna, Kaisa, Gangplank, even Neferi, who can take over in the back half of the game, like, you're hoping and praying that you don't lose early. It's honestly a huge shock that they won early. Like, they were better in the early game, which I think is a really good sign. But player of the game and player of the series for me is going to go to Levi. The captain ends up getting it. He really stepped up when it mattered the most. The Viego in game 4, the Neferi in game 5. Both of these games were gigantic from Levi, and boy did they need it in order to get across the finish line. I think, again, this game was significantly more in their favor, just because I like their draft and I like their ability to play out their draft, and obviously they played better. But, you know, Levi really had to step on the gas. I think their macro at the beginning of the series, games 2 and 3, did not look good, and they specifically did not look good from Levi, and so for him to be the most important player in their final 2 wins of this series, I think was huge for this team, especially because I think me and a lot of other analysts have been talking about, like, okay, is this guy still an elite player? Is he still somebody that can show up internationally and be able to compete with, like, Western teams? Is that the kind of player that Levi is, or is he, like, a tier below that now, which is what I thought coming into this tournament? Well, as it turns out, he is still pretty darn good. I also have to give a huge shout out to Kiaya. Massive top gap in this series, if we're being entirely honest. Gigo had a really bad day, and we saw, you know, previously with Furia against G2, how important it was for someone like Gigo to actually be able to step up and, like, be able to compete 1v1 with the enemy top laner. Furia was in that series mostly because Gigo was just straight up better than Broken Blade in terms of how that went down. Gigo being way worse today, which we will get into, was kind of a death sentence for Furia with how important he is towards their comp. But Kiaya, big part of why that worked, because he was really, really good. And again, it's Kiaya and Levi. It's the two, you know, franchise players for GAM, and quite frankly, the region-defining players for Vietnam that ended up really stepping up here. I also do want to give a shout out to Artemis and Elio. You know, I've been very critical of their play. I do not think they were good at all against BLG, and I do not think they were particularly good domestically either, specifically Artemis, but I think he stepped up and was the better AD carry in this series, and that's all he really needed to be, was just not number 10. I think it's fair to say that he accomplished that. Eris was totally fine down the stretch. I really like putting him in for the later games in the series, because I do think his mechanical prowess can start to shine a bit more, whereas Emo's stability in the early part of the series might actually be more of a positive overall. So I kind of like the decision-making there, but just, again, congratulations to GAM. I think a lot of people were kind of, expecting Furia to win after how things went yesterday, but GAM proving BLG is really that good. It's not that GAM is all that bad. And then for Furia, it's sad that this team is going out in 10th because they played 10 games at this tournament, 2 best-of-5s that both went the distance, and they aren't able to win either of those Game 5s, but it is what it is. Again, I don't love the draft here in Game 5. I think you're relying a ton on Ezreal to be able to establish pressure in the mid-game, which IU's just not able to do, and then Kassadin's really on his own in the late game to try to win. Like Trundle, Gnar, they can theoretically help out that win condition. Even Karma can theoretically help out that win condition, but into Gangplank, Orianna, Kai'Sa, Neferi, even Bard, right? It's just so difficult for the Kassadin to be able to take this over. I think he was kind of put in a bad position in the first place. Credit to Toots. What a tournament from Toots. I said he was the weak link of this team coming into this tournament. That was anything but the truth. He was the best player on this team, maybe outside of JoJo throughout this entire tournament. I was so impressed with how Toots played. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep that up. Tatu is also really solid in this series, and I do want to give him, his flowers as well. He's a facilitator player. He's never really going to be taking the spotlight in terms of what Furia does, but I do think he ended up performing very admirably. I love JoJo. I'm glad he kind of proved that he is a good player. It didn't really showcase itself here in Game 5 on the Karma, but again, it's just a hard game for this bot lane to end up playing out. Really, the two main players that did not have a good day, IU, who he was good in one game, he was good in Game 3. Outside of that, he was outclassed by Artemis, and these are probably the two worst AD carries at the tournament. The one that played worse is probably going to go home, and unfortunately, that was IU here today. And then Gigo, who's like the most important player on this team, just not being good enough. He's going to get dead of the game again for game number 5 here. He was completely useless on this Gnar, constantly mistiming his Mega Bar and being mini for every single fight, and then going in and instantly dying. It's just kind of a disaster. Really not the kind of circumstance you wanted from a player that, like I said, is so important towards what Furia does overall as a team. So, I don't think they have anything to be upset about. They went, to Game 5 in both of their series that they played. Everybody projected them to be 10th, and just because they lived up to that expectation doesn't mean they did anything wrong. I think they overperformed expectations, in my opinion, at this tournament. But congratulations to GAM. They take on the loser of BLG and G2, which we will talk about next. Whoever that is, they're going to be pretty major underdogs, basically no matter what, but we know this team has the resilience to be able to push through, and we've seen the LCP cause some upsets already this year. I'm not counting this team out just yet. But then moving on now to our second series of the day, and this was kind of the more important one, I think, for the overall tournament, even if it was less interesting because it's not an elimination series. This is a qualification series. The winner of this matchup will end up making it to the main stage. They will be done with the play-ins, whereas the loser will have to take on the newly successful GAM Esports to make their way there as well. It's a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 2 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports. Of course, two teams that are kind of coming from very different perspectives in their round 1 matchup. Bilibili having no trouble taking down GAM, the team that just was successful in the lower bracket, dominating that in a 3-0 victory. They had a couple of early games where they ended up going down in gold, but really, for the most part, they were the better team by a pretty large margin across all 3 of those games, especially from the mid-game onwards. And then you have G2, who it's the complete opposite, right? They went to 5, they really had to struggle to beat Furia, and they really weren't consistent at any point. And I think the big problem for G2 that I'm going to continue to hammer home, because I really do think this is their biggest issue. It's not talent, it's not the fact that they're not good enough, it's that there is no true identity for G2 as a team right now. They haven't really found a way to win games consistently with their players, and I think they've actually kind of done the opposite. They've kind of gotten less out of their own talent level than a lot of other teams have been able to do, and it's a reason that they haven't been able to win the LEC so far this year after having so much success doing so in previous years of this same exact format. You have players like Skumon and Labrov that really want to play for late game team fights where they're kind of the newbies onto the team, and so maybe you don't want to play for them as much. Maybe you want to try and, continue playing for Caps and Hansam and Broken Blade a bit more, but their styles just don't necessarily mesh with the new players. You brought in talent, but you didn't necessarily bring in complementary skill sets. We've seen that specifically in the bot lane with players like Hansama wanting to skirmish a lot early and Labrov just not being great in that phase. But what we have seen is that players like Caps and Broken Blade are probably even better in this current meta at being a little bit slower, and I think this team in general has been way better the slower pace they end up playing, the more tactical and methodical they end up playing. When they try to play for fast skirmishes, that's where things have started to go wrong for G2. I think the slower and more methodical they end up being, the better, and I think drafting for that is likely going to be the right way moving forward. The problem is that's not the meta at the moment. You're not seeing Xin Zhao and Vi and Pantheon play slow. That's not necessarily how things go, but Broken Blade has kind of gone back to being, TSM, Schalke, Broken Blade, getting caught in side lanes pretty regularly, needing a ton of assistance from his jungle. That means bot lane's not really getting that assistance, and Hansama's really not been relevant at all this year. I'm not saying he's been bad, he's just not really done anything so far in 2025, and Caps, I think, has not necessarily been his 2024 self in terms of how he's been able to play, because his jungler is constantly having to try and, like, stabilize other lanes. It just feels like G2 is always on the back foot, and I don't think that's going to get better against Bilibili Gaming. They looked incredible in round number 1 as anticipated, but this is a team that made a change in the middle of the season to shore up what their playstyle was. This was a slower paced team at the beginning of the year, at least in comparison to what maybe you think of when you think of Bilibili Gaming, but Wei going out, Beichuan coming in, all of a sudden, like, the pace picks up a lot. Knight and Bin start being a lot more successful. On feels like he's unlocked across the entire map, and things are just way better for Bilibili Gaming in that regard. I think if BLG is able to speed up the tempo and really create a lot of action pre-15 minutes, I don't believe this series is going to be close. Not only is G2 not particularly good in that phase of the game, at least in their current state, but BLG is already a more talented team. They draft better because G2 is one of the worst drafting teams at this entire tournament. Them and Movistar Koi, quite frankly. The LEC in general has just been super behind in terms of draft meta for the entire year, but like, Bilibili already has more talent. They have better drafts. They have a better idea of what their game plan is, and their game plan's easier to execute. I don't think this is going to be a close series, especially after what we saw on day number 1. My prediction in yesterday's video was BLG 3-0. I'm going to stick by that. I really do think I would be more surprised if G2 won a game than if they didn't. That's how far I think these two teams are apart right now. But let's go ahead and see if that ends up, paying off, if that ends up being correct, or if I end up being incorrect on that, and if G2 is just a lot better than I'm giving them credit for, if perhaps yesterday was just a bit of a learning process for them. The only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And they looked great in this game number 1. I think that there maybe could be some small things that you can criticize. I think G2 actually had a couple of moments, particularly Skumond and Broken Blade, where they were actually kind of relevant in this one. But for the most part, BLG's execution was significantly better. And then obviously you get to the end of this game, which is a bit heartbreaking for G2. They're like 2 or 3 autos away from taking the Nexus, and they just can't do it. They end up getting aced, and, BLG marches into the base and takes the Nexus for themselves. It's obviously a very disappointing finish. They came very close, and, I think there are a lot of things to like from G2's performance. This was probably better than most of their games yesterday, just in terms of raw production, but I think what this shows is that even in a best case scenario, or a close to best case scenario for G2, BLG still is kind of just better as a team. They were up in gold for basically the entirety of this game, and they certainly had tempo. Credit to G2. I think that there were some, situations where their macro actually kind of came through, and that's one thing I do want to say about G2. Their macro is actually pretty solid, all things considered, in comparison to a lot of other Western teams. They're not really one of these teams that relies on their mechanical skill in order to win, but that's why I think they prefer slower paced games where they can just kind of outthink their opponent, because when they have to outhands them, when they get to these team fights, especially against these top tier Eastern teams like Bilibili Gaming, they're not able to win them, at least not consistently, and I think that's what we saw here. As per usual, we start with draft here. I honestly don't think either draft is necessarily favored over the other. I think BLG does need to win early, or at least they should win early. You're looking at Misfortune, you're looking at, Xin Zhao being able to roam the jungle, and you're looking at things like Ornn on the other side. Things that are just generally a bit more passive, all things considered. I think BLG do have a lot of ways to kind of push tempo. I love the Annie into Aurora matchup for Annie, at the very least. I think it's really easy to be able to shut down Aurora with those stuns later on in the game. Shout out Caps for actively picking Aurora into Annie. I just don't understand why mid laners continue to counterpick themselves just to get better synergy with their own jungler. I don't even think Aurora Pantheon is like the best Pantheon, like mid synergy lane. Whatever. It is what it is, right? Like, you yourself banned out Talia because you didn't want Knight picking it, which does make a lot of sense, but it just kind of is what it is. I don't think Caps was as relevant this game as maybe he would want to be. Of course, you have some moments at the beginning of this game that are, up and down, we'll just say, but really, I think for me, it comes down to the Alistar, and I will continue to die on the hill that Alistar is probably the best engaged support in the entire game right now, specifically for this meta. I know I put like Rel and Nautilus in tier 1 alongside Alistar, but I would take Alistar over anything else if I did have the option to, specifically for these teams that do have supports that you can trust, that want to be playmakers, that have good ideas for maybe when they want to go in. I think Ali's just better for that than, something like Nautilus or especially Leona on the other side of this matchup. Rel is really the only other champion that can kind of compete on that front, and Alistar has a great matchup into Rel. And we saw this here. Like, On was incredible in this game. He's going to get player of the game, in my opinion, for game number 1. Multiple 3 or 4-man Alistar knockups that comboed perfectly into the bullet times. Like, that's why you draft this bot lane, is for that magic combo where you land the 3-man knockup and everything just kind of goes your way. We saw On be able to enable that multiple times throughout this game, and I just honestly was really excited to see that. On has been spectacular in the second half of the year. I honestly don't think he's gotten enough credit for just how good he's been. I love the supports in the LCK. I think we're just kind of forgetting that maybe KL and On are just the 2 best supports in the world at their best, right? Like, shout out Keria. People got so mad at me in the comment section for having Keria at 4th in terms of the support rankings, and I'm gonna die on the hill. I don't really care that people are upset about me for that. I think On is spectacular, and I think he continues to show that. Credit to Elk for being able to follow up on a lot of those engages. Again, people hate on Misfortune for basically no reason. I don't really understand why people don't like this champion, but really good game from Elk, all things considered, to be able to follow through on the Alistar knockups. Bin and Knight were also really solid. Really no complaints. Bin's ults were sometimes a little bit, meh. Like, he would only hit 1 or 2 in some of these fights, but outside of that, like, his damage was actually pretty maximized in terms of, like, making sure the Flame Splitter was on, like, everybody throughout every single fight. It really was great positioning, and Bin's always been very good at Rumble. Knight was really good at Annie, especially in terms of setting up kills in the back half of the game. Beichuan was fine. Like, really didn't have to be all that exceptional. BLG made some mistakes, and there was a reason G2 almost won this game, but at the end of the day, BLG's execution was a tad bit better. I think they were better throughout this game, and that's why they came out on top. And for G2, this was a really good shot for them to win game number 1, not just because they came very close, but because their draft, I think, puts them in a position where they can try and win game number 1. Do I think they scale incredibly hard? No, like, it's just hard for me to imagine, like, a Pantheon Ezreal-led team dominating in the late game, but I love Aurora at playing the late game. I think she's a very strong champion, even if I wouldn't have picked her in this matchup. And I think generally G2 has looked great with these particular champions. Labrav on something like Leona. Obviously, Alistar has been one of his best champions. Blitzcrank is something he's kind of known for, but, Broken Blade on Ornn, something that can play weak side top. That's where he's been a lot more comfortable, at least across this year. Skewmon on Pantheon, that's been easily his best champion so far in 2025. I think outside of Maokai probably has been, like, the Skewmon champion, and I still believe he's better on facilitators than he is on, like, these hyper carries, or not hyper carries, these hyper skirmishers in the early game, things like Pantheon and Xin Zhao, but in terms of that style, Pantheon has worked way better than, like, Vi has for G2, and so you're picking a lot of comfort. Hans has played so much Ezreal throughout his career, and yet you're still not able to pull out a win in game number 1. Couple of fights that were really awesome. Broken Blade and Skewmond in particular, I think, played a couple of these fights great. Skewmond has been awesome for G2 at this tournament, easily the best player on the team. It just hasn't really mattered. Caps needs to start stepping up. A couple of nice moments for him in terms of the burst he was able to do. I just think this is a pretty hard Aurora game, all things considered. And then Labrav, man, like, dud of the game here, pretty obvious. I know there's a big Labrav hate train. He was really excellent in their 3 wins against Furia, pretty bad in their losses against Furia. He is a very feast or famine player, but I will continue to die on the hill that the reason Labrav is struggling on G2 is because he's like the antithesis of what this team wants their support to be. He is a late game enabler. He is the best team fighter in the support position in Europe, and they don't want to play for that. They just don't want to do it. Like, they don't want to try and play for Hans Sama to carry 5v5s. That's what Labrav did last year, and that's why he was the best support in the LEC, in my opinion. He's been nowhere close. He's, in fact, not been valuable. He's been, like, negative value for G2 throughout this year because they're asking him to do a bunch of things that he's not good at. Is Labrav a one-dimensional player? Kinda, yeah, but that one dimension can still be utilized to great effectiveness, as we've seen throughout his career. G2's just not even trying, and when you have, Pantheon needing to carry this big weight of responsibility to carry the game, things do become a lot harder. Hans Sama has not really stepped up throughout a lot of this year, and I've really not been impressed. I, again, feel pretty vindicated for putting him so low, even in the domestic AD carry rankings. Caps has just not been, claps throughout this year. He's not the kind of guy that can elevate the rest of the team like he was in 2024, and Broken Blade's taken a major step back, even if he was pretty good in this game, and now they're down 0-1 in this series. They need to win game 2. You go down 0-2 versus BLG, you're in a pretty dangerous spot. But for Bilibili, you want to get that 2-0 lead. You want to kind of wipe this up pretty quickly. A 6-0 playing stage is on the table for them, and if they can do that, I think they're going to feel pretty good going into the main stage. But that starts with game 2. Are they going to be able to take it and take a dominant lead in this series, or is G2 going to be able to equalize and have us go into game 3 for the second time today, 1-1? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Bilibili Gaming, they are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and it is starting to get less and less close between these two teams. I think that is unfortunately the takeaway after game number 2 is that, oh yeah, BLG are just kind of better, and the underperformers on G2 are certainly not stepping up and starting to perform at a ridiculously high level. They're still very much struggling to find their footing, and BLG are not waiting for G2 to start figuring out what they want to do. This is a very weird draft, I think, overall, for both of these teams, really. Like, it's not just, G2 that I think has a weird draft. I think, G2 prioritizing things that I personally don't like, and I've talked pretty extensively about not liking on this channel Vi Ari early on, especially with Taliyah up. I'm gonna be honest, like, Vi Ari's really not all that bad. I know I kind of shit on the duo because I do think it's worse than people give it credit for. Like, I don't think it's a top 1 mid-jungle duo in the game or anything like that, but I think specifically with Taliyah up, it's almost impossible for me to ever feel justified picking Vi Ari. Like, I really do think that Taliyah is just kind of a perfect pick into both of those champions. It kind of shuts down exactly what both Vi and Ari want to do. And so to B1 Vi, to leave up Taliyah for Knight, like one of the best, if not the best Taliyah player in the entire world, and then allow him to pick something like Skarner to be able to affect the team fights later on in the game anyways, like, it just feels like a bad decision, and that's adding on to the fact that Skewmod isn't even particularly good at Vi. It's been one of his least successful champions over the course of this year. Caps Ari is totally fine. He had a couple of highlight plays here. He got a solo kill on the bot side, like, awesome, really happy for him, but, like, it doesn't matter. Skewmod had no pressure in this game, and quite frankly, with G2, it kind of betrays their win condition, in my opinion anyways. You're looking at Jax and Sivir rounding out this comp, and it's like, oh, you want to play for late game. Like, you don't even really want to win in the mid game. You don't have a ton of tools to actually do anything there because Jax is not really going to be able to punish Sion ever. In fact, Sion is a massive problem for your team because nobody really breaks through Sion on this team. It's going to have to be Sivir who, eventually will get there after 4 items or whatever, but that's not happening anytime soon. Sion's like unkillable for BLG, and, Broken Blade lost early anyways, which I guess is kind of expected, but you've also got a Sivir who's down in CS and isn't particularly in a good spot. Like, this game is doomed pretty quickly for G2, and I think a lot of it is them just prioritizing things wrong. Like, again, I don't want to, like, die on the hill, but man, like, G2 and the LEC in general cannot draft. Like, they just can't do it. They are constantly putting themselves at disadvantages going into these games because they just don't understand what they are as a team, and they don't understand what enemy teams want to try and take advantage of when it comes to them, and I think, once again, they kind of fell into that trap, but for BLG, this is an awesome draft. I think part of why it feels like G2 had such a bad draft is because BLG had such a good one, where it does feel like they have a couple of options in a couple different directions. They have more tempo in the early game, mostly because of that Taliyah in the mid lane, but I don't think this is like an Omega Taliyah game. We've seen a couple where, especially into Vi Ari, it's just like, oh, Taliyah's going to run and take over this. I think there are options for G2 in this one. This isn't one of those drafts where Taliyah instantly wins you the game or anything like that, but giving the best Taliyah player in the world, Taliyah doesn't exactly feel like a great decision when you're on blue side. It feels like a very weird one. You've got Varus Karma as a bot lane. I think this is a very good bot lane, especially to try and shut down Sivir in terms of her ability to scale. I think that's a good spot, and like I said, Sion's kind of the Omega pick in this draft because who exactly is killing Sion? Like, who is breaking through the front line of Sion Skarner when you have a Karma kind of throwing shields onto everybody? This is a very, very scary draft for BLG, and as long as Elk can do damage throughout the back half of this game, which trust me, he was able to do, it's a pretty easy game to win, and Elk is going to get player of the game for this because those arrows were piercing, that I will definitely say. Elk's not going to get enough credit for how he's played this tournament so far. I was kind of lower on Elk's 2025 getting into like MSI, like, playoffs and end of regular season. A lot of people were calling him, an all-pro caliber player. I didn't necessarily see that on tape. I mean, I was calling Elk the best AD carry in the world last year, and so I'm not low on his talent level. I put him number 2 in terms of the players at this tournament, but I just hadn't seen it on tape, and I wanted to see it start to step up. This was a really great performance. If you wanted to give player of the game tonight, I totally understand. He was more active on the map and certainly was involved in more things. I think that there were a couple of things he could have optimized a tad bit more from the Taliyah, but whoever you want to give it to, like player of the game out of the carry duo, I think it probably should go to one of those two, Knight or Elk, but Knight continues to be fantastic. You can't give this guy Taliyah, specifically not on red side. Like, you actually have to be like smoking crack in order to do that. There's just no way, man. There's just no freaking way. On continues to be a massive menace. He was chasing down people on Karma yesterday. He's doing it again in this game. It's just crazy what this guy's able to do when he gets any champion that can do any damage. He plays like an aggressive mid laner. Like, that's just who On is. It's very funny to watch. And Bin was, again, the Omega pick in this draft. Not only did he massacre Broken Blade in lane, because he did. He was up a ton of resources resources and was actually in a really good spot. But that's kind of expected. That's Sion into Jax. It's really hard to punish Sion. He was unkillable in these team fights, and I think part of that is, again, the draft for G2 not having enough damage to break through this strong front line, but it's also Bin's positioning. The only negative you can give him is he didn't proc Sion passive at any point in this game. Beichuan was, again, really good, but mostly a facilitator and just kind of there to allow Knight and Elk and Bin and On to take over the game. That's his role on BLG. That's why he's been good for this team. Overall, they're just looking dominant, and they're one game away from sweeping G2 out of this series and getting themselves into the main stage without having dropped a single game. I'm sure they want to do that now that they are so close. They've won 5 in a row. Can they get 6? Well, the only way to know is to talk about game 3. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series in a 3-0 sweep. And man, this was not close, was it? This was the least close game of the entire series. That being said, G2 for some reason randomly was able to push for towers basically the whole game. It was kind of funny how things ended up working out, but they really had no business trying to fight BLG really at any point. Credit to BLG. They're just incredible, and they understand how to play around their win conditions so well. They even limit tested a bit in this game, in this game 3, in terms of their draft, because this is a very weird draft from them. I'm not sure I like it all that much. I don't love the draft from G2, but I think theirs is definitely better and more cohesive in terms of what the meta is. Clearly, they wanted to try out and see whether or not Veigar was going to be viable moving forward at this tournament. I think they got their answer. Knight turned pretty strong by the time this game hit its peak at 33 minutes, but this will be a quick wrap-up, because honestly, there really just isn't a lot to talk about in terms of counterplay between these two teams. There are some narratives that I think a lot of the community is already touching upon that I think are relatively fair, but let's go ahead and get into it. Knight is going to get player of the game for this Veigar. He's going to get player of the series. I'm spoiling this a little bit. Knight is my player of the series for this one. I considered On, I considered Bin, I considered Elk. Really everyone that's not Beichuan. Credit to Beichuan. He was totally fine in this series. Wasn't a problem in any way. He just wasn't the main character. But BLG dominated, and I think this Veigar game is really kind of indicative of just where this team was at going into this final game, where it's like, all right, we're going to give you Twisted Fate on B1, a champion that I think me and some other people think is a little bit overvalued in terms of all the bans that it's been receiving over the course of this tournament. As a response, we are just going to take Veigar. We're going to stack and scale up, and we're going to not worry too much about your ability to move around the map, because we're going to play slow. We're not going to worry too much about what Twisted Fate is doing everywhere, because once Veigar hits a breakpoint, he's just going to be able to one-shot everybody in the game. And even then, like, Knight's roams were better this game than Caps. Like, it's just absurd. It's like not fair how bad it ended up getting for G2 so quickly into this game, but we can talk about draft again. I think G2 technically wins draft, if you really want to say this. Not only do I think they have more tempo in the early game playing off of Twisted Fate, and even really playing off of the Olaf, but I do think their mid game is a little bit more consistent. I think their lane setups are pretty nice. I don't think they scale super well, but you've got outs in the late game. Senna is obviously always an out, basically no matter what, and then Olaf can theoretically be an out because there's not really a ton of ways to stop him, especially once he presses R. Veigar Cage basically doesn't matter in this game, and so you're not super worried. The problem is, once you lost early, where your comp is probably at its strongest, that's not a good sign. Like the mid-game pressure and prio that you're supposed to be able to generate with TF moving around the map and using his ultimate to create panic, and, Veigar not being able to follow, that never happened. Like, that never came to fruition in game number 3, and so a lot of the plans just ended up going unutilized. And for BLG, they scale pretty well. Like, Veigar Kai'Sa is obviously just going to be a problem in the later part of the game, but you have frontline to be able to protect them. I love Poppy in general, but especially in this draft, I think it does a lot to be able to kind of, keep Rakan from being the only thing that needs to be like the engaged threat. I think Renekton can help separate, things like Senna from the mid lane, which is really valuable towards Veigar and Kai'Sa, who want to play front to back here. Like, overall, I just like the idea of what BLG ended up, drafting for themselves, even if I think their comp is more difficult to execute. But I think they are better, so it didn't really matter. Again, I wish I could go into more depth, but BLG just kind of smoked him. Like, they were just better in every fight. Knight gets super fed on the Veigar, and all of a sudden, 8-0-4, he ends up winning the game and player of the series. Again, if you wanted to give it to On, he's the other player I really considered here. He was awesome in Game 1 in the Alistar. His engages were great. His Karma game in Game 2 was also really good. I would argue this Rakan game in Game 3 was probably the least flashy game he had of the series, ironically enough, on a champion like Rakan, but it still was pretty good. Like, you're not complaining about how he ended up playing. Beichuan probably had his best game of the series in Game 3 on the Poppy, but was more of a background player. Bin massacred Broken Blade. We'll get to it. Elk was also really solid. BLG was just the better team. I wish I had more to go into. There's genuinely just not a lot to talk about. BLG was better, and G2 was worse, and quite frankly, G2 is bad. Like, I don't really want to make grandiose, like, overarching statements like that, because we knew that G2 was at least, like, a tier and a half down from BLG, and them losing even 3-0 was kind of what we expected, but the reality of the situation when it comes to G2 is that this is not a good team. Like, they have a lot of fundamental flaws that they need to figure out, and until they figure those out, it's not going to get better for this roster. Broken Blade's dud of the game, and quite frankly, he's been dud of the tournament so far. This guy has been horrible at MSI, and it's not just MSI. Like, trust me, I want to say this. Like, go back and watch the LEC tape even in the playoffs. This guy had a ton of bad games in the LEC. It wasn't punished this heavily because, you know, and I've said this before, and LEC fans are going to get mad at me as they've done before. The LEC this year has kind of been garbage, at least in terms of domestic play. I'm not saying all the teams are garbage or that, you know, none of the players can win. I'm just saying the quality of play so far, especially recently in the spring split, has been very low in the LEC, and so I don't think he gets punished nearly as much domestically, but now he's going international, and a lot of the mistakes he was making domestically are getting punished, and especially against a team like Bilibili Gaming, you can't get away with playing the way that Broken Blade has played. This Olaf did not work. He needs to get put on weak side, like, every game. I'm talking Ornn, Scion, you know, whatever. Like you cannot give him responsibility right now until he proves that he can do something other than what he is doing right now, which is die over and over and over again. Super frustrating. But it's not just him. Like, Skumond was completely irrelevant. I think he's been the best player on the team in this series, but so much for that, right? Like, so much for carrying games. Like, this guy's a Trundle Maokai player, and he's gonna have to be the best player on the team. That's not good. Caps was not nearly on the level of Knight. He wasn't the problem entirely in this series, but this was his worst game of the series, that's for damn sure. Hansam was completely irrelevant. Like, I'm serious. Like, this guy doesn't do anything. He's not losing games for this team. He's certainly not trying to win games for this team, and Labrov's one of the weakest supports at the entire tournament. Things are just not going well for G2, and I'm very scared for this team. Like, right now, you know, losing this, they go down to the lower bracket. They gotta take on GAM. Like, they absolutely should and probably will beat GAM. Do I think they're gonna do well in the main stage? Hell no. Like, is this the worst team in the main stage? Probably. Like, in the way that they're playing right now, it's just, they're bad. Like, there's nothing else left to say. This isn't out of character for them. This is kind of how they've played all year long. Their drafts are the worst at the entire tournament, and their gameplay has certainly not lived up to it. Do I think they're smart? Do I think they have good macro? At times, yes, especially from ahead. Do I think they're good at getting leads? No, I really don't. And so I'm very worried about G2, and I'm really not worried at BLG. Obviously, congratulations to this team. They're done with the play-in stage. They did not drop a single game in the play-ins. Not that that should be entirely surprising, but congratulations to Bilibili Gaming. They move on to the main stage. Depending on who their opponent is, they could go on an even deeper run. You know, I got flack. I got a lot of criticism for putting them as a top 3 team at this tournament. If they were a top 3 team, they were going to perform like they did. They were going to not drop a game and dominate basically everything. You know, they played like a top 3 team at this tournament. We'll have to see in the main stage whether or not they live up to that expectation, but at least for now, the talent's coming through. It feels like they have a good identity, and I think people are going to rue the day they underestimated Bilibili Gaming. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI Play-Ins Day number 2 overview and analysis video. Only one series left in the play-in stage. It's the lower bracket finals, the last qualification match. It's G2 Esports taking on GAM Esports, and previewing this is honestly pretty easy for me. If G2 loses this series, I mean, we're talking about the LEC in general as being a cooked region. Like, that's genuinely where this is at, because G2, you know, at least for a lot of this split, looked, you know, pretty strong, and generally a lot of the problems that they've had have just been exacerbated at this tournament. I don't think they're going to struggle here. Like, I don't think it's that serious. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Do I think G2 and the LEC are maybe a little bit worse than people are giving them credit for? Yes, but do I think they're good enough to beat GAM? I sure hope so. Like, golly, like, if they don't, holy shit, like, things are starting to get into full panic mode. And so, you know, with GAM moving on, do I think G2 are going to struggle with GAM like they struggled with Furia? No, I think they will win this series. I would hope they don't drop a game. Like, theoretically, they should win 3-0. Do I think GAM are going to put up a fight? Maybe, but my prediction is G2 3-0. I know that's not going to be a popular prediction, but if they don't win 3-0, I'm going to be disappointed. Their matchup into GAM is even better than it was into Furia individually, because they don't have that, like, killer instinct. Now, if Kiaya obliterates Broken Blade and gets this to Game 5, like, yeah, am I going to think that G2 is going to not win a game in the main stage? That's where I'm going to start going with my thought process. But for now, G2 3-0 is my prediction. At the worst, G2 3-1 should be how this series ends up going. But let me know if you agree or disagree with that take down in the comment section below. Let me know how you think Bilibili's going to do in the main stage. Do you have as much confidence in them as I do? Or are you maybe a little bit lower on what they are than I am? I'm curious to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering every day of MSI on this channel. That includes tomorrow, the final series here in the play-in stage, and then everything that happens in the main event. So stick around for that, hit subscribe, and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all